The first Floridians, 10,000 BCE, 1513 CE. Long before European eyes gazed upon Florida's shores, this peninsula was home to sophisticated indigenous civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests human habitation in Florida dates back at least 14,000 years, when Paleo-Indians hunted mastodons and giant ground sloths across a landscape vastly different from today's subtropical paradise. As sea levels were much lower during the Ice Age, Florida's landmass was nearly twice its current size, extending far into what is now the Gulf of Mexico. By 3000 BCE, Florida's climate had evolved into something resembling its current state, and indigenous peoples had developed complex societies. The Calusa dominated southwest Florida, building impressive shell mounds and canal systems that demonstrated remarkable engineering skills. They created a powerful maritime empire without agriculture, sustaining themselves through fishing and gathering. The Timucua inhabited North Florida, living in villages surrounded by wooden palisades and practicing agriculture alongside hunting and gathering. The Tequesta controlled southeast Florida, while the Apalachee developed one of the most politically complex societies in the southeast, with their capital near present-day Tallahassee serving as a major ceremonial center. These societies were far from primitive. The Calusa built elaborate canal systems connecting coastal areas to inland waterways, some over 30 feet wide. They constructed massive shell mounds that served as foundations for temples and chiefs' houses, some rising 30 feet above sea level. The Timucua created intricate pottery and developed sophisticated agricultural techniques, growing corn, beans, and squash in carefully managed fields. Their society was stratified, with hereditary chiefs, nobles, commoners, and slaves. The indigenous peoples of Florida had developed complex religious systems, extensive trade networks reaching as far as the Great Lakes, and rich oral traditions that preserved their histories across generations. Spanish discovery and early colonial period, 1513-1763, the arrival of Juan Ponce de Leon on Florida's shores in April 1513 marked the beginning of European involvement in the region. Sailing from Puerto Rico, Ponce de Leon landed somewhere between present-day St. Augustine and Jacksonville, claiming the land for Spain and naming it La Florida, possibly for the Easter season, Pascua Florida, or for the land's lush, flowery vegetation. Contrary to popular legend, Ponce de Leon was likely more interested in gold and slaves than any mythical fountain of youth, though this tale would become permanently associated with Florida's early history. The Spanish conquest of Florida proved far more difficult than anticipated. Ponce de Leon's second expedition in 1521 ended in disaster when he was mortally wounded by a Calusa arrow. Panfilo de Narvaez's expedition of 1528 became one of the most catastrophic ventures in colonial history, with only 4 of 300 men surviving, including Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, who would write extensively about his experiences. Hernando de Soto's expedition from 1539 to 1543, while covering vast territory and reaching as far as the Mississippi River, found no gold and left a trail of disease and destruction among indigenous populations. The turning point came with Pedro Menendez de Avilés in 1565, charged by King Philip II with establishing a permanent settlement and eliminating French presence in Florida. Menendez founded St. Augustine on September 8, 1565, making it the oldest continuously inhabited European established settlement in what would become the United States. Menendez brutally eliminated the French colony at Fort Caroline near present-day Jacksonville, executing most of its inhabitants and establishing Spanish dominance in Florida. The Spanish mission system became the primary tool for colonizing Florida's interior. Beginning in the 1580s, Franciscan missionaries established a chain of missions stretching from St. Augustine to the Apalachee region around Tallahassee and northward along the Georgia coast. These missions served multiple purposes, converting indigenous peoples to Christianity, creating a buffer against English expansion from the north, and establishing agricultural centers to supply St. Augustine. At their height around 1650, the missions may have served as many as 26,000 indigenous converts. However, the mission system ultimately contributed to the demographic catastrophe that befell Florida's indigenous peoples. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through native populations with devastating effect. The Timucua, who may have numbered 200,000 at contact, were reduced to fewer than 1,000 by 1700. Combined with slave raids from the English colonies and their indigenous allies, particularly during Queen Anne's War, 1702-1713, Florida's original indigenous populations were virtually eliminated by the mid-18th century. British Florida, 1763-1783, the 7 Years' War dramatically altered Florida's trajectory. In 1763, Spain ceded Florida to Britain in exchange for Havana, which the British had captured during the war. The British divided Florida into two colonies: East Florida, with its capital at St. Augustine, and West Florida, centered at Pensacola. This 20-year British period, though brief, brought significant changes to Florida's development. The British actively promoted settlement, offering generous land grants to attract colonists. They brought a plantation economy to Florida for the first time, establishing indigo, rice, and sugar plantations along the St. Johns River and the Atlantic coast. Notable figures like Dr. Andrew Turnbull established ambitious colonies. His New Smyrna settlement brought 1,400 Mediterranean colonists, Greeks, Italians, and Minorcans, to Florida in 1768, though harsh conditions led to its collapse within a decade, with survivors relocating to St. Augustine, where their descendants still live today. The British also established better relations with indigenous groups, particularly the emerging Seminole people, Creek Indians, who had begun migrating into depopulated Florida in the early 18th century. British traders established posts throughout Florida, creating economic ties that would influence regional politics for generations. The British period saw Florida's first newspaper, the East Florida Gazette, and the construction of the King's Road, connecting St. Augustine to Georgia, improving communication and trade. During the American Revolution, Florida remained staunchly loyal to Britain, serving as a haven for Loyalist refugees from the rebellious colonies. St. Augustine's population swelled with displaced Loyalists, and Florida became a base for British military operations in the South. However, Spain, allied with the American revolutionaries, captured Pensacola in 1781, presaging Florida's return to Spanish control. Second Spanish period and American acquisition, 1783-1821, the 1783 Treaty of Paris returned Florida to Spain. But this second Spanish period was marked by weakness and instability. Spain, exhausted by European wars and facing revolutions in its Latin American colonies, could barely maintain control over Florida. The territory became a refuge for escaped slaves from the United States, indigenous peoples resisting American expansion, and outlaws of every description. The Seminoles, now firmly established in Florida, developed a unique society that incorporated escaped African slaves as Black Seminoles. This created tension with American slaveholders, who demanded the return of their property. Cross-border raids became common, with Americans attacking Seminole villages and Seminoles retaliating against Georgia plantations. The situation provided the United States with pretexts for intervention. The War of 1812 demonstrated Spain's inability to control Florida. British forces used Pensacola as a base, and in 1814, British Marines helped train escaped slaves at the Negro Fort on the Apalachicola River. After the war, this fort remained a symbol of resistance, harboring hundreds of free blacks and indigenous peoples until American forces destroyed it in 1816, killing most of its defenders. Andrew Jackson's invasions of Florida in 1814 and 1817-1818, the First Seminole War, effectively demonstrated American power and Spanish weakness. Jackson captured Pensacola, executed 2 British subjects for allegedly aiding the Seminoles, and showed that Spain could not defend Florida. Though Jackson's actions created international controversy, they convinced Spain that negotiating a transfer was preferable to losing Florida through conquest. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, ratified in 1821, transferred Florida to the United States in exchange for American assumption of $5 million in claims against Spain and recognition of Spanish sovereignty over Texas. On July 17, 1821, Spain formally transferred East Florida to the United States, with West Florida following on July 21st. Andrew Jackson briefly served as military governor, establishing American authority and demonstrating the harsh treatment that would characterize American policy toward Florida's indigenous and black populations. Territorial period and early statehood, 1821-1860. As an American territory, Florida faced immediate challenges. The population was sparse and diverse, including Spanish colonists, Seminoles, Black Seminoles, escaped slaves, and a growing number of American settlers. The territorial government, established in 1822, chose Tallahassee as the capital, a compromise location between the former capitals of St. Augustine and Pensacola. The most defining conflict of this period was the Second Seminole War, 1835-1842, one of the longest and costliest Indian wars in American history. Triggered by the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and attempts to force Seminoles to relocate to Oklahoma, the war saw brilliant Seminole resistance under leaders like Osceola, Micanopy, and Coacoochee. The Seminoles employed guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to Florida's swamps and hammocks, frustrating American military efforts. The war cost the United States over 20,001,500 soldiers' lives. The Seminoles suffered tremendous losses, with most eventually forced to relocate to Oklahoma, though several hundred retreated deep into the Everglades, never surrendering. The war devastated Florida's economy and slowed settlement, but it also led to the construction of a network of forts and roads that would facilitate future development. Despite these conflicts, Florida's American period saw significant development. The territory's population grew from about 35,000 in 1830 to 87,000 by 1845, with most settlers coming from Georgia and the Carolinas. They established a plantation economy based on cotton, using enslaved African American labor. Middle Florida, centered on Tallahassee, became the heart of this plantation society, with large estates producing cotton for export through the port of Apalachicola. Florida achieved statehood on March 3, 1845, entering the Union as a slave state paired with Iowa as a free state to maintain congressional balance. The state's first decades were marked by continued growth of the plantation economy, expansion of railroads, and ongoing conflicts with remaining Seminoles, culminating in the Third Seminole War, 1855, 1858, which ended with most remaining Seminoles accepting reservation lands or payment to relocate. Civil War and Reconstruction, 1860-1877. Florida's population of just 140,000 in 1860 made it the smallest Confederate state, but its 44% enslaved population and plantation economy tied it firmly to the Southern cause. Florida seceded from the Union on January 10, 1861, the third state to do so. The state's strategic importance lay in its long coastline, cattle ranches that supplied Confederate armies, and salt works essential for preserving meat. The Civil War in Florida differed from other southern states. No major battles occurred on Florida soil, but the state saw numerous skirmishes and raids. The Battle of Olustee on February 20, 1864, was Florida's largest engagement, where Confederate forces defeated a Union attempt to cut Florida off from the Confederacy. The battle involved one of the first major deployments of African American troops, the 54th Massachusetts, who fought courageously despite suffering heavy casualties. Union forces occupied key coastal points early in the war: Fort Pickens at Pensacola, Fort Taylor at Key West, and later Fernandina and St. Augustine. These occupations created a unique situation where Florida had two governments, Confederate in Tallahassee and Union in occupied territories. The blockade severely impacted Florida's economy, though blockade runners operated from various points along the coast. Florida provided crucial supplies to the Confederacy, particularly beef cattle and salt. The state's extensive coastline yielded salt through evaporation works, making Florida the Confederacy's largest salt producer. Confederate forces and cow cavalry units protected these resources from Union raids, engaging in guerrilla warfare throughout the state's interior. Reconstruction brought dramatic changes to Florida. The state was readmitted to the Union in 1868 under a new constitution guaranteeing civil rights for freed slaves. African Americans, who comprised nearly half the population, actively participated in politics, with 19 black legislators serving in the 1868 legislature. Jonathan Gibbs became Secretary of State and later Superintendent of Public Instruction, establishing Florida's public school system. However, Reconstruction faced violent resistance from white supremacists. The Ku Klux Klan terrorized black voters and white Republicans throughout the state. The disputed election of 1876, partially decided by Florida's contested electoral votes, ended Reconstruction when federal troops were withdrawn as part of the compromise that made Rutherford B. Hayes president. This ushered in the Redemption period, as white Democrats regained control and systematically dismantled civil rights protections for African Americans. The Gilded Age and Progressive Era, 1877 to 1920. The post-Reconstruction period transformed Florida from a frontier state into a modern economy. though this transformation came at great cost to African Americans and the environment. The 1885 Constitution institutionalized segregation and effectively disenfranchised black voters through poll taxes and literacy tests. By 1900, Jim Crow laws regulated every aspect of life, from separate railroad cars to segregated cemeteries. Two men particularly shaped this era: Henry Flagler and Henry Plant. Flagler, a Standard Oil partner, built the Florida East Coast Railway, extending it from Jacksonville to Key West by 1912. His railroad opened the Atlantic coast to development, and he built luxury hotels in St. Augustine, Palm Beach, and Miami, creating Florida's tourist industry. Plant developed Florida's west coast, building railroads to Tampa and establishing the Tampa Bay Hotel, transforming Tampa into a major port. The Spanish-American War of 1898 brought national attention to Florida. Tampa became the staging ground for the invasion of Cuba, with Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders training there. The war stimulated Florida's economy and demonstrated its strategic importance, leading to increased military investment in the state. This period saw the establishment of Florida's citrus industry as a major economic force. Despite devastating freezes in 1894-95 that pushed citrus cultivation southward, the industry rebounded stronger. By 1920, Florida produced over 10 million boxes of citrus annually. The invention of refrigerated railroad cars allowed fresh fruit to reach northern markets, making Florida oranges a national commodity. The drainage of the Everglades began in earnest under Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, 1905-1909, who campaigned on creating an Empire of the Everglades. Massive canal projects attempted to convert wetlands into agricultural land, fundamentally altering South Florida's ecosystem, while creating rich agricultural areas, particularly for sugarcane. These projects had devastating environmental consequences that wouldn't be fully understood for decades. The convict lease system represented one of the era's darkest chapters. Florida leased state prisoners, predominantly African American men arrested on minor charges, to private companies for labor in turpentine camps, phosphate mines, and railroad construction. Conditions were brutal, with mortality rates exceeding 20% annually in some camps. This system, not abolished until 1923, essentially re-enslaved thousands of African Americans. The boom, bust, and depression, 1920 to 1940. The 1920s brought unprecedented growth to Florida, culminating in one of America's most spectacular real estate bubbles. The Florida land boom of the 1920s saw millions of Americans, intoxicated by stories of easy wealth and year-round sunshine, invest in Florida real estate. Entire cities were planned and sold, sometimes before a single road was built. Miami's population grew from 30,000 to 75,000 between 1920 and 1925. Coral Gables, designed by George Merrick as a city beautiful, sold $150 million in lots in its first 4 years. The boom created architectural treasures still visible today. Addison Misner designed Palm Beach's Worth Avenue and created the Spanish Revival style that defined South Florida's aesthetic. Miami Beach, developed by Carl Fisher from a mangrove swamp, became America's playground. The Marx Brothers comedy, The Coconuts, satirized the era's excesses, while tin can tourists, early RV travelers, began the democratization of Florida tourism. However, the boom contained seeds of its own destruction. Speculation reached absurd levels, with lots changing hands multiple times daily, each time at higher prices. Properties were sold from blueprints, binders, options to buy, were traded like securities, and buyers purchased land sight unseen. The bubble began deflating in 1926 when northern newspapers reported stories of fraud and the IRS began investigating unreported income. The 1926 Miami hurricane delivered the fatal blow. With winds exceeding 145 mm, it killed 373 people and left 43,000 homeless, causing damage equivalent to $164 billion today. The storm shattered confidence in Florida development. The 1928 Okeechobee hurricane proved even deadlier, killing over 2,500 people, primarily black agricultural workers, when Lake Okeechobee's dike failed, flooding the surrounding areas. These disasters, combined with the 1929 stock market crash, plunged Florida into depression 3 years before the rest of the nation. The Great Depression hit Florida particularly hard. By 1930, 26 of Florida's banks had failed. Tourism collapsed, construction ceased, and agricultural prices plummeted. The Mediterranean fruit fly infestation of 1929 led to the destruction of thousands of acres of citrus groves. Desperate conditions led to social unrest, including the 1935 Labor Day hurricane that killed over 400 people, many of them World War I veterans working on the overseas highway. The New Deal brought relief and lasting changes to Florida. The Civilian Conservation Corps established camps throughout the state, building parks and fighting forest fires. The Works Progress Administration constructed schools, post offices, and courthouses that still serve communities today. Social Security particularly benefited Florida, which had a higher percentage of elderly residents than most states. Most dramatically, the Overseas Highway, completed in 1938 using the abandoned Florida East Coast Railway bridges, connected Key West to mainland Florida by road for the first time. World War II and post-war transformation, 1940, 1960, World War II, transformed Florida more dramatically than any event since statehood. The state's year-round flying weather and extensive coastline made it ideal for military training. By war's end, Florida hosted over 40 military installations. MacDill Field in Tampa became a major bomber training base, while Naval Air Station Jacksonville trained thousands of pilots. Camp Blanding, near Stark, processed 800,000 soldiers, temporarily making it Florida's fourth largest city. Miami Beach's hotels were converted to military use, with the Army Air Forces taking over 85% of the area's hotel rooms for barracks and training facilities. Over 500,000 airmen trained in Miami Beach, dramatically altering the area's character. German POWs worked in Florida's agricultural fields and forests, with camps scattered throughout the state. German U-boats operated off Florida's coast, sinking 24 ships in 1942 alone, leading to blackouts along the coastline and Coast Guard beach patrols. The war accelerated Florida's demographic and economic transformation. Military personnel stationed in Florida often returned as residents. The GI Bill enabled veterans to attend Florida's universities and buy homes, spurring subdivision development. Defense contractors established permanent facilities, diversifying Florida's economy beyond agriculture and tourism. The post-war period saw explosive growth. Florida's population doubled from 1.9 million in 1940 to 4.9 million by 1960. Air conditioning, becoming widely available in the 1950s, made year-round residents comfortable for millions. This technology fundamentally altered Florida's development patterns. enabling large-scale inland development away from coastal breezes. The space race brought high-tech industry to Florida. Cape Canaveral, chosen for rocket testing in 1949 due to its isolated location and eastward ocean trajectory, became America's gateway to space. The 1958 creation of NASA and the 1961 announcement of the Apollo program brought thousands of engineers and technicians to Central Florida, creating a high-tech corridor that transformed the region from citrus groves to suburban sprawl. Development innovations shaped modern Florida. The Mackle brothers pioneered the mass-produced planned community, building Port Charlotte, Deltona, and Marco Island. Leonard Rosen's Cape Coral, begun in 1957, used aggressive marketing and installment plans to sell lots to northern buyers. These developments established patterns of sprawling, car-dependent communities that would define Florida's landscape. Civil rights era and social change, 1950, 1970, Florida's civil rights movement, while less nationally prominent than movements in other southern states, achieved significant victories against entrenched segregation. Harry T. Moore, founder of Florida's NAACP, organized voter registration drives that increased black voter registration from 5% to 31% between 1944 and 1950. His assassination on Christmas Day, 1951, when Klan members bombed his home, made him the civil rights movement's first martyr. The 1956 Tallahassee bus boycott, sparked by two Florida A&M University students refusing to give up their seats, preceded the Montgomery boycott and demonstrated organized resistance to segregation. Led by Reverend C.K. Steele, the boycott lasted 7 months and integrated Tallahassee's buses. Florida A&M University and Bethune-Cookman College became centers of activism, with students conducting sit-ins, wade-ins at beaches, and voter registration drives. St. Augustine became a major civil rights battleground in 1963-64. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaign there, featuring night marches and beach wade-ins, met violent resistance from Klan members and police. Television images of peaceful protesters being attacked in America's oldest city helped build support for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The city's integration came only after federal intervention and extensive negotiations. School desegregation proceeded slowly and contentiously. Despite the 1954 Brown versus Board decision, most Florida schools remained segregated throughout the 1950s. Token integration began in Dade County in 1959, but meaningful desegregation didn't occur until federal courts mandated busing in the 1970s. The process sparked white flight to private schools and suburbs, reshaping metropolitan areas. The Cuban Revolution profoundly impacted Florida, particularly South Florida. Between 1959 and 1962, over 200,000 Cuban refugees arrived in Florida, fundamentally altering Miami's demographics and culture. Operation Pedro Pan brought 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children to Florida between 1960 and 1962. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, launched from Guatemala but planned in Miami, solidified South Florida as the center of Cuban exile politics. The 1960s also saw environmental awareness emerge as a political force. The proposed cross-Florida barge canal, intended to connect the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, galvanized environmental opposition. Marjorie Stoneman, Douglas's activism, building on her 1947 book The Everglades River of Grass, helped stop the canal and established environmental protection as a legitimate political concern in Florida. Modern Florida emerges, 1970-2000. The 1970s began with environmental crises that reshaped Florida's approach to growth. The 1971 drought reduced Lake Okeechobee to its lowest recorded level, while algae blooms devastated marine life. These crises prompted the 1972 Water Resources Act and the establishment of water management districts, acknowledging that Florida's growth had environmental limits. Walt Disney World's 1971 opening near Orlando represented a new scale of development. Disney's 27,000 acres dwarfed Disneyland and created an entire tourism ecosystem. The Reedy Creek Improvement District gave Disney governmental powers, establishing a model for private control of development. Disney World's success transformed Central Florida from agricultural backwater to international destination, attracting other theme parks and creating America's most visited tourism corridor. The Cocaine Cowboys era of the late 1970s and early 1980s brought violence and corruption to South Florida. Miami became the transshipment point for Colombian cocaine entering the United States. The 1980 Liberty City riots, sparked by the acquittal of police officers in the beating death of Arthur McDuffie, revealed racial tensions exacerbated by economic inequality. The Mariel boat lift that same year brought 125,000 Cuban refugees to Florida in 6 months, straining social services and heightening tensions. This chaos paradoxically enhanced Miami's transformation into an international city. Drug money, laundered through real estate and banks, fueled construction booms. The 1980s television show Miami Vice glamorized the city's image, attracting tourism and investment. Meanwhile, waves of immigrants from Haiti, Nicaragua, Colombia, and other Latin American countries created a truly cosmopolitan metropolis. Hurricane Andrew's 1992 devastation exposed Florida's vulnerability to natural disasters and inadequate building codes. The Category 5 hurricane destroyed 63,000 homes and damaged 124,000 others, causing $26 billion in damage. The storm revealed widespread construction fraud and led to stricter building codes and insurance reform. However, it also demonstrated Florida's resilience, with rapid rebuilding showcasing the state's economic dynamism. The 1990s brought unprecedented prosperity and growth. Florida's population reached 15 million by 2000, making it the fourth largest state. The tech boom created new wealth, particularly in telecommunications and aerospace. The cruise industry, centered in Miami and Port Everglades, became the world's largest. Tourism reached 50 million annual visitors, while retirees continued flocking to the state, making Florida America's oldest state by median age. Contemporary Florida, 2000%. The 2000 presidential election placed Florida at the center of national controversy. The 537-vote margin triggering recounts, butterfly ballots in Palm Beach County, and hanging chads became symbols of electoral dysfunction. The Supreme Court's Bush v. Gore decision stopping the recount remains controversial, highlighting Florida's crucial role in national politics as the largest swing state. The housing bubble of the 2000s saw Florida property values soar to unsustainable levels. Speculation returned reminiscent of the 1920s, with condo flipping and subprime mortgages driving prices. The 2008 collapse hit Florida harder than almost any state. By 2010, Florida led the nation in foreclosures, with nearly 20% of mortgages delinquent or in foreclosure. Entire developments stood empty, and unemployment reached 11.4%. Environmental challenges intensified in the 21st century. Red tide and blue-green algae blooms regularly devastate marine ecosystems and tourism. Sea level rise threatens coastal infrastructure, with Miami Beach spending hundreds of millions on pumps and raised roads. The Everglades restoration, authorized in 2000 as the world's largest ecosystem restoration project, proceeds slowly amid political and funding challenges. Climate change poses existential questions for a state where millions live barely above sea level. Hurricane patterns shifted dramatically, with 2004-2005 bringing 8 hurricanes to Florida. Hurricane Charlie's unexpected turn devastated Punta Gorda, while 4 hurricanes crisscrossing the state in 2004 caused $45 billion in damage. Hurricane Michael in 2018 became the first Category 5 hurricane to strike the Panhandle, essentially erasing Mexico Beach. These storms highlighted the increasing costs of coastal development and the insurance crisis threatening Florida's economy. Demographic transformation continued accelerating. Florida's Hispanic population exceeded 5 million by 2020, with communities from every Latin American nation. The Puerto Rican population exploded after Hurricane Maria, making Central Florida a center of Puerto Rican culture outside the island. Meanwhile, tech companies and financial firms relocated to Florida, attracted by tax advantages and lifestyle, creating new economic sectors beyond tourism and real estate. The COVID-19 pandemic tested Florida's governance and revealed deep political divisions. Governor Ron DeSantis's resistance to lockdowns and mask mandates made Florida a conservative cause célèbre, while drawing fierce criticism from public health advocates. The state's relatively early reopening attracted new residents fleeing restrictions elsewhere, accelerating in migration. Over 1,000 people daily moved to Florida during 2020-2021, straining infrastructure and housing markets. Political polarization intensified as Florida shifted from swing state to Republican stronghold. The 2018 gubernatorial election, decided by 0.4%, gave way to 20-point Republican victories by 2022. Culture war issues, from education to LGBTQ rights, dominated politics, with legislation on critical race theory and Don't Say Gay garnering national attention. These conflicts reflected broader tensions as Florida balanced growth with quality of life, diversity with cultural cohesion, and economic development with environmental preservation. Florida today and tomorrow. Contemporary Florida stands as America's third most populous state, with over 22 million residents generating the nation's fourth largest economy. The state's $1.4 trillion GDP exceeds many nations. Built on tourism, agriculture, aerospace, defense, and increasingly technology and finance. Florida hosts more than 140 million tourists annually, making it the world's premier tourist destination. The state produces 70% of America's oranges, leads in sugarcane production, and remains crucial to America's space program, with commercial space companies joining NASA at Cape Canaveral. Yet Florida faces existential challenges. Climate change threatens the state's existence more than any other, except perhaps Louisiana. Scientists project 2 to 8 feet of sea level rise by 2100, potentially displacing millions and submerging valuable real estate. More intense hurricanes, extended droughts, and ecosystem collapse could fundamentally alter Florida's habitability. The insurance crisis, with major companies fleeing the state and citizens' property insurance, becoming the insurer of last resort for millions, threatens economic stability. Water remains Florida's most precious and threatened resource. The Floridan aquifer, supplying water to 10 million Floridians, faces saltwater intrusion and pollution. Lake Okeechobee's health determines South Florida's water supply, yet agricultural runoff creates toxic algae blooms. The Everglades, despite restoration efforts, remains at risk, with only 50% of its original extent surviving. Competition between agriculture, development, and environmental needs intensifies annually. Social tensions reflect national divisions while taking distinctly Floridian forms. Rapid growth strains infrastructure, with traffic congestion and housing affordability reaching crisis levels. The median home price exceeding $400,000 prices out many workers essential to Florida's service economy. Generational divides between retirees and younger residents create conflicting priorities for public spending. Cultural conflicts between Florida's increasingly diverse population and conservative governance generate constant controversy. Education emerges as a critical battleground and necessity. Florida's universities conduct crucial research on climate adaptation, hurricane prediction, and ecosystem restoration. Yet political interference in curriculum and academic freedom threatens their standing. K-12 education, ranked in the bottom half nationally, struggles with teacher shortages exacerbated by political conflicts and low pay. The state's future depends on educating a workforce capable of competing in high-tech industries while preserving the service economy employing millions. The enduring paradox of paradise. Florida's history reveals a land of perpetual reinvention, where each generation's paradise becomes the next's problem to solve. From Ponce de Leon's failed conquest to modern climate change, Florida has challenged human ambition while rewarding audacity. The state built on drained swamps and barrier islands defies nature daily, yet depends entirely on natural attractions for its economy. This essential paradox, civilization imposed on wilderness, permanence sought in the impermanent, defines Florida's character. The indigenous peoples who first called Florida home understood its rhythms, living within natural cycles rather than attempting to dominate them. Spanish colonizers learned Florida couldn't be conquered conventionally, requiring accommodation with environment and inhabitants. Americans had spent 2 centuries trying to engineer paradise, creating in the process both remarkable achievements and potential catastrophe. Modern Florida embodies American dreams and anxieties in concentrated form. The promise of reinvention that draws millions to Florida reflects the national myth of self-creation. The state's diversity previews America's demographic future, while its political conflicts mirror national divisions. Florida's environmental challenges, from sea level rise to ecosystem collapse, represent global threats in microcosm. How Florida addresses these challenges will influence responses worldwide. The stories of Florida's peoples, indigenous inhabitants, Spanish colonizers, enslaved Africans, Seminole resistors, Cuban exiles, Caribbean immigrants, Northern retirees, and countless others weave together into a complex narrative of conflict and cooperation, exploitation and opportunity, destruction and creation. Each group has contributed to Florida's character while struggling to preserve their own identity within the state's homogenizing forces. As Florida enters its sixth century of recorded history, it remains what it has always been, a frontier where imagination meets reality, where the impossible becomes commonplace, and where the American experiment continues evolving in unexpected directions. The state that began as a mythical paradise pursued by conquistadors has become a real paradise perpetually threatened by its own success. This tension between aspiration and reality, between natural glory and human ambition, ensures Florida's story remains as dynamic and unpredictable as the hurricanes that regularly reshape its shores. Understanding Florida's history means recognizing that today's crises echo past challenges while presenting unprecedented threats. The state that survived colonization, war, depression, and transformation must now confront challenges to its very existence. Yet Florida's history also demonstrates remarkable resilience, creativity, and capacity for reinvention. Whatever Florida becomes in the decades ahead will reflect both the weight of its history and the irrepressible optimism that has always characterized this most improbable of American states. The complete story of Florida reminds us that history isn't merely the past, but a living force shaping the present and future. In Florida, where history, myth, and reality intertwine like mangrove roots, the past remains viscerally present. In place, names echoing extinct peoples, in ecosystems struggling to survive development, in communities shaped by centuries old conflicts, and in the ongoing tension between paradise promised and paradise lost. Florida's history, like its future, remains a work in progress, a story still being written by millions who call this remarkable, impossible, essential state their home.